Right. And now we dive directly into the discussion and hopefully have a good discussion. And yeah, if you have any things you want to contribute or any questions you want to ask, just raise your hand. This shall be kind of the open discussion for this. Right. I quickly take this down.
Do you want to sit or stand?
I sit, so we can have like a...
So we'll be civilized then.
Yes, yes.
All right.
We're all on the same page then. Great. So to start, I wanted to ask you two, what do you experience in your day-to-day work at Oxford University Press, and likewise at PLOS? What are brands, or how do you actually manage brands, or are they managed by the content that you publish?
I think it's a combination of things. I think a lot of the brand does come into, how good is the journal. This may be a bit of a long digression, but I tend to see brand as the equivalent of a journal brand is the equivalent of a letter of recommendation.
Yeah.
Everybody hates the impact factor. And I think that the big problem with the impact factor is you're trying to use a quantitative measure to measure a qualitative question. You're asking, is this work any good? Is this journal any good? Is the work of this researcher any good? Well, that's an opinion.
Yeah.
And as a former scientist, I can say very clearly that we are obsessed with numbers. I used to be a developmental biologist. We'd take these beautiful movies of cells moving out of the spinal cord, going through this tissue called the somite, and then we'd do a certain treatment. The cells would stop, they'd turn, they'd go around the thing. We tried to publish that. They said, that's descriptive. You're just showing pictures of stuff. So we said, all right, we'll put it in a computer program that labels the cell, tracks its speed and its direction, publish that as an Excel spreadsheet graph. Oh, that's quantitative. That's data. That's real science now. And I think there's a bias towards anything that's a number, even if it's a crummy number.
Yeah.
And to me, the big thing if you want to get rid of the impact factor is you think about, can we get past this idea that opinions are bad and that you're asking a qualitative question, you need qualitative input. And that to me is where brand comes in. So the journal that you publish in says something about the work. It says the editor of this journal and their handpicked experts said this work is good enough to be published at the level of this journal. Now, what that level is entirely up to you as the outside observer. You may say, wow, this got into Cell. Cell's a great journal. Or you may think, well, Cell just publishes a bunch of garbage from the editor's friends. And it's totally subjective. But again, we're talking qualitative, we're talking opinions, and that's okay. And it's the equivalent of an application gets a letter of recommendation. Well, how do I treat that letter of recommendation? Who is it from? What do I think of that person? What did they say about the person they're writing it about? Again, there's a subjectivity when you're talking about qualitative questions like that, and I think we get too caught up in the numbers rather than thinking about. Yeah. And I think brand is the equivalent of that.
Yeah.
It's an answer to those questions.
Okay.
Where to begin? I don't think 45 minutes is long enough to talk about branding, and especially when it's the last session of the day. So thank you all for hanging around. This is great to have you all here. So I think of the branding a little bit differently than what David described. I want to start with a quote by Jeff Bezos. He said, "A brand for a company is like a reputation for a person. You earn reputation by trying to do hard things well." And I think at PLOS, we've tried to do a number of very hard things well over the last 15 years. And so the first thing that we tried to do was prove that open access could provide a high quality output for research content. So our first two journals, PLOS Biology and PLOS Medicine, focused on that highly selective research content, high rejection rates, the most perceived impact for the articles that were selected. And I think the PLOS reputation overall was burnished because those journals emerged as being really good journals.
Yeah.
The next set of experiments that PLOS did was to take the community aspect. And so we launched PLOS Genetics to focus on the genetics research community and pathogens for the microbiology community and neglected tropical diseases. And the purpose around that was to really generate community awareness of specific content and making that content available open access, and to prove that open access worked as a community paradigm. And I think we succeeded at that. The next thing that we tried to do was to launch a mega journal. And I knew we wanted to discuss a mega journal here. So PLOS launched PLOS One because the internet. And the situation is that our conception of journal brand quality stems from the pre-internet era, right? It's very expensive to produce a print journal and mail it around the world. You only had 120 or 200 pages to fill. You could only get 10 research articles in that particular print issue, so you had to be very selective about the articles that went into that print issue. And then the internet happened. And the need for a high-level selective criteria around what goes into a journal bucket goes away with the internet. The idea is we have Google Scholar, we have Bing, we have PubMed.
Bing?
Equal time for Microsoft. But we have all of these tools now through the internet that didn't exist long ago. And because we have these tools now, the arbitrary nature for perceived impact no longer needed to be a criteria for selection. So PLOS One reshaped the focus to say, is this scientifically sound? Should this article be part of the scientific record? And that's more of an objective type of question rather than a subjective question around selectivity. And that resonated with the crowd. So to David's point about a journal brand being sort of a letter of recommendation, the recommendation for a PLOS One article is different than the recommendation for a PLOS biology article. The PLOS One article says it's fundamentally sound research. It doesn't make a statement about it being groundbreaking or not.
But it's still a rigorous review process that it has passed this test.
That's exactly right. And I think a number of people are actually very surprised at how rigorous the peer review process for one is. In 2012, the acceptance rate for PLOS One was about 70%. We have not changed the editorial criteria. And in 2016, the acceptance rate was closer to about 50%. And I think that's a function of a number of different market factors that we can go into later if we need to. But the brand itself is strong, but it's different than a selective brand.
Well, when we look at the whole market, there are like about 30,000 journals. With the rise of the mega journals or cascading journals who also get larger and larger, do you think that there's a massive change actually happening, that the top tier brands get more and more the only recognition, and who doesn't make it into the kind of top tier brands of a certain community? It doesn't need to be only the interdisciplinary top tier brands, but can also be the top tier brands of certain research communities. If the research doesn't make it into these, it will make it into kind of the mega journals or the rest, which is mainly a large repository, and the brand doesn't have any impact whatsoever.
Sure. So cascading has been around for a long time, and I used to work for Elsevier, and Elsevier has a long strategy of offering journals at a number of different tiers or levels of quality, and so that strategy has been around for a very, very long time. I think another change that the internet and the mega journal has offered, though, is rather than playing that, is it pachinko, where you put the marble in at the
Yeah.
top?
Yeah.
You know, you submit to one journal, 8 months later you get your rejection letter, you submit to another journal, 6 months later you get a rejection letter, you submit to another journal, 4 months later you get your rejection letter, and then finally you're published. A lot of time has passed during that process. And with the rise of the mega journals and that criteria where it just needs to be scientifically sound, some researchers are using that as their second choice. Okay, I submitted to Nature, I got rejected, I'm going to send it to Scientific Reports now. Some people are using it as their first choice because they may think they're about to be scooped by a competing lab. So +1 is the first choice for a lot of papers because there's that promise of a faster publication process. I think at some publishers that have introduced mega journals as, you know, sort of the trapeze safety net for their publishing portfolio, some authors are probably very happy to be published quickly and go straight into that safety net, and other publishers probably want to play pachinko and be evaluated for multiple different levels.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I would just comment. I mean, that was the initial promise. I mean, Peter Binfield had said when PLOS One had first started was basically you're going to have the high-end journals and you're going to have mega journals, and what we're sort of eliminating is that middle class of journals. And I think that it's probably true in some fields, it's probably true in not so true in other fields. I do want to take exception to something you said. I think the mega journals are just as much slaves to the impact factor as any other journal, in that part of the reason why you would send it to a mega journal rather than your niche area journal. All right, I'll send it to, you know, a big journal, high impact factor, it didn't get in. I can send it to the best journal in my field, but its impact factor is still lower than PLOS One.
Sure. Yes.
I'm, you know, and you know, if you see, you know, the sort of shifting between Scientific Reports and PLOS One, which is in this phase now, and I suspect Scientific Reports gets bigger, its impact factor is going to go down, PLOS One's going to go back up. There's going to be this sort of cyclical thing there, and I'll, as my favorite anecdote on the Scholarly Kitchen, our most common search terms are PLOS One and impact factor.
Yeah, we've noticed that.
And we've realized, and I yell at Phil Davis all the time, I realized that any article, if you can include the words PLOS One and impact factor in the title, you will get 10 times the readership of an article that doesn't have those in there, so.
Yeah. Scholarly Kitchen is our long tail.
So, yeah, please. That's a question.
I'm not sure who this question is for, but maybe.
Well, yeah, please use the microphone.
Yeah, they're recording us.
I think you mentioned that there were some broad categories of how brands position themselves, you know, as a premium journal, high impact journal, or trying to win on service.
Yes.
In a crowded market where there are several high impact journals, at what point does differentiating yourself on service versus your top tier competitor make a difference? And have you studied that?
Just among like the top tier brands.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, I haven't studied that particularly.
Okay.
Just among top tier brands, I've just seen at the broader market. It's definitely the differentiation is between the actual top tier content, which is getting the recognition. On the other hand, the services that the researcher gets. But we see more and more that the top tier brands have the services as well, and they get faster as well. It's not like a long peer review process anymore. So they get quicker. They add services. May it be like paper hive so that they can actually comment on something, so that service of paper hive shifts then additional equity to the brand of the journal. So we see these services as well. But the question there is how much experience does an author have with different journals actually? I mean, you have to have interacted with the journal to see what the experience with the brand actually is. There's not yet kind of an indicator, and that feeds into what my next question actually, an indicator of the service quality or the mechanistic service quality that the publisher or journal has. Actually,
Right.
that would be an important indicator. That's something that's coming up with the Project Cupcake, probably.
So you mean some analog to the impact factor bit for service?
Yes.
That measures, yeah.
Some
Probably
measure,
something like
metric.
that.
Yeah.
Because a researcher does not interact with 20 different top-tier journals, if there are any, so many in a certain community.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I mean, I'd argue you can lose an author with very poor service. If you have a really bad experience with the journal, that's it. I'm never sending them an article again. I think they're still going to go for what is going to be best for my career is where I'm going to send my paper. And people put up with 1.5 to 2 years to get a paper into Nature or into Science. If service mattered more than prestige, then they wouldn't put up with that. But I think you get to a point with a lot of journals where, all things being equal, I have my favorites because they treat me well or it works really well. 2 more anecdotes. When I was a scientist, we had 2 journals that were about the same level. We would always send our papers to the one that did color figures for free. Well, we don't have to pay for it. So, and I work with a journal that I'm not going to name, but they have an incredibly slow copy editing process where there's a very traditional journal, and they really dig into the articles, and they do this huge, and it takes like, a year from acceptance to the thing to get published in an issue, and they're in a competitive field, and they're seeing their submissions drop and drop and drop, and the good papers are going to the competitive journals that get things in and turn it around really fast, and they're not seeing the competition from journals that are way above them and way below them, but because they're in this grouping of like 6 journals within 0.05 of the impact factor, they're definitely taking a hit because of their poor quality of service, and no matter how much I yell at them, they won't stop doing that.
I'd also say that services, if you include tools, you would be wrong to include submission tools as services.
Yeah.
Those are most journals are using tools that are from vendors that are shared across the organization. So submitting to one journal that uses Aries Editorial Manager is not going to be that different of an experience to submitting to another journal that uses that same system. So that's not much of a differentiator. And in fact, from those systems, Scholar One, Editorial Manager, EJ Press, there are modest differences, but I think from our feedback from PLOS, talking to the folks that have submitted with us, is that there is not a perceived difference between those systems, and it certainly has not been an influencing factor in where a researcher is going to submit their article. And we found that unfortunate because we're developing a manuscript system called the PERTA, and it's live on PLOS Biology. The feedback from authors has been fantastic. But it hasn't affected the submission rate at all.
I had a follow-up question. David, you commented that you could lose an author due to services potentially, but what about a reader? What about in the authorship experience, if they're rejected or considering the editorial process, they feel they didn't get a quality experience, regardless of the levels of service, time to publication, et cetera, like that. It's really actually the quality of the review, the quality of the editorial decision, and the feedback. Do you think that it could influence the perception of the brand as a reader when the person is wearing both hats as a researcher?
Yeah, no, I think so. But on an individual level, and if you get enough of those, then that's going to damage your brand. If if you're continuously retracting articles, say, or as an author, I came in and there was this clear bit of favoritism, or the editor didn't listen to me, then that's going to change my perception of what I read in the journal. Of other people must have gone through that too.
Okay, yeah, that was actually fits into. Oh, there's another question. Go on. Go ahead.
Took me a second. So this is going back to Mark's point earlier of the differentiation between, for example, PLOS Medicine and Biology and PLOS One, soundness, significance, that sort of difference. But wasn't there a perceived benefit of launching PLOS One, like utilizing the Public Library of Science brand as opposed to, No Name One?
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, and it's an interesting point because we didn't name it PLOS Biology 1 or PLOS Medicine 1. I mean, there wasn't this pre-established journal brand to hang one off of. It was the organizational brand. And so I mean, that is a great point. We do feel like the PLOS brand is really strong. Case in point, so we have the 7 journals that we publish. You may or may not be aware that we're also a software developer, and we've published some software tools, including article level metrics, which is an open source product called Legato. How many people have heard of Legato? One hand, fantastic. I mentioned Aperta, the manuscript system that we use for PLOS Biology. We have a self-hosted web platform that we call Ambra. Ambra is also available open source. So, but those products are intentionally not branded as PLOS Legato or PLOS Ambra because as open source tools, we want the community to use them, and we thought that branding them as PLOS would be a disincentive for other publishing houses to use those tools. We would really love for you all to use those tools. That's why we made them available open source.
Yeah, no, I think the branding of, the PLOS journals with PLOS in the name is part of PLOS's genius. Same thing, you put Nature in the name of a journal, automatically it's the top journal in the field, or Cell, or it's kind of maddening.
And it's not even, sorry, David, it's not even the name, it's also the URL, because a lot of people refer to Nature scientific reports, even though they tried not to.
Well, that was sort of their hedge of, well, if these mega journals aren't that good, it doesn't have the Nature, the name in it, so it won't hurt us. And it's a struggle for us at OUP. I mean, the University of Oxford is a pretty stinking good reputational brand, but 70% of what we publish are journals that are owned by research societies or research institutions. So it's not like we can tell the Society of Toxicology that you're now the Oxford Society of Toxicology. So it's not an opportunity that we have in there. And I just wanted to come back to a point that Marcel made of that readers and authors don't really know publisher brands, and that's true with the exception of a journal that has, the name in there. But I would say that librarians do know publisher brands. They know who publishes what, and they know the reputation of every publisher. They all know, these guys are impossible to work with. These guys are great. They have fair prices. So I think it's another aspect of brand is not just reader and author, because they're actually a lot of times not the ones who are the direct customers paying the bills.
They account for threshold for actual then purchases bundles or something.
Yes, less so for you.
Yeah, right, true. But that's actually a good point because we see that, like, especially with when we researched with larger publishers like Wiley, Elsevier, Springer, or Oxford as well, we've seen that they always think, or they often thought that actually the company name brought some brand equity onto a new journal when they launched a new journal, but this was actually kind of a journal family. When you have like advanced materials, and then you bring advanced materials and chemics, or then you extend the family into biology and extend it into different fields, is actually kind of the journal family that then extends the brand equity, and it's not Wiley in this instance.
Nobody cares. And it's a struggle we've had also with, because we say to people, this is your society, we publish a society journal. Yeah. You're a member of this society, why not support, any money that gets made off this journal goes right back into support for your community. Why don't you publish in your society-owned, society-benefiting journal more so than the one that's owned by a big corporation where the money and the benefits just go to the shareholders, and they don't really seem to care all that much, or they're not aware who owns what. You look at all the surveys, how do you choose a journal, and a research society owns it is always way down at the bottom.
And that's actually another point I wanted to make before the question. It directly feeds into the difference between readers and authors. That is, we mostly talked about how authors choose journals or choose journals to publish in, or they're distracted by services or impact factor or whatsoever. How does a reader, when there's like the list of search result, like a search result and there's like 10 articles, is it more like the imperfect substitutes, like the theoretical, like the theory would say it's imperfect substitutes, you have to choose this because this is the content you need based on the abstract, for instance? Or is it more like there is a Nature article in it, so I have to click this first because I assume this is more relevant for me? Do you experience something like this, maybe more important for this?
I think there's a hierarchy. I think you talk to most researchers and they know, and it doesn't necessarily line up with impact factor, but they know the journals in their field, and they'll, all right, I've got a stack of papers to read this week, which one goes on top? And it's not even necessarily what is, Nature probably gets a good amount of attention, but the type of work you do and your at least very small community of people who do that specific work, we tend to publish in these 3 journals, and if a paper with the right keywords comes out in one of those journals, that's probably going to be the most directly relevant to my work, so that goes up on the top. And I think there's, that gets into brand. And it's I always feel that more filtering mechanisms are better, so I think it's a really important filtering mechanism.
But this is the issue that must change when it comes down to you with open access or with open science measures in general, especially with post-publication peer review. If you want to apply something like this, you actually don't have the brand as a filter anymore because it gets unfiltered into the public. Also with more, when you support more the preprint service, for instance, it is unfiltered there, and you are more likely to judge based on the actual content than on the brand that filters it.
Right. I think there are actually 3 different flavors of the audience. So there's the reader who's looking for individual research articles, and at that reader level, I'm not sure that the brand actually matters so much, because if I'm working on a specific field, I sort of want to know everything that, from an abstract, is relevant to my research. Now, I may...
Or the right author. The author's brand comes into play.
Exactly. Very much so. And that could even mean the lab that it's coming out of. So that's from the...
Is that something that's more important, the researcher and the institution? Do you experience this?
I think it depends on the field.
Less the institution, more the researcher, because everybody knows who's working in your field. You go to the meetings, you know who's doing what, and you know who does good work. And again, you've got subjective, you've got a researcher's brand. And I would say that's as important. Certainly, journal brand is part, but researcher brand is hugely important in that filtering mechanism.
Absolutely, and you're going to want to read those articles. No matter what, because it is relevant to your research. From the author perspective, I think and how they view the publications, there's probably a difference between the prospective authors that are looking for a decision on where to submit to versus the authors that have actually submitted and been published. If I'm a published author, I'm probably thinking of services in terms of the peer review process. Was it fair? Was it quick? How the speed to publication, was that fast? Post-publication matters, like, is my article getting read? Are there article level metrics that I have access to that tell me how many times it was read and downloaded and shared on Facebook and Twitter? Those sort of metrics matter to me as a published author. As a prospective author, you're probably not looking critically at an article level. You're looking more at an aggregate journal level. And unfortunately, the impact factor, as you mentioned, is the most common resource for that, which is really, really unfortunate. There was a meeting associated with the American Society for Cell Biology meeting several years ago that resulted in the Declaration on Research Assessment, or DORA. Many organizations have signed DORA, which is a pledge not to promote their journal impact factor. PLOS is original signatory of that. I think that's really great for science, because the impact factor, as you pointed out, Marcel, is a really bad metric to use across disciplines. And there are a number of different resources that could be used better.
Yeah?
So
Maybe
I'm-
that's question.
Yeah, that's a good stopping point.
Yeah.
Okay.
I actually might not want to ask the question that I'm going to ask to close your session, but with all the drive to open science, open source, and open platform solutions, and different models of open peer review, and all of this, and the author being the brand and knowing the communities you're in, and then saying we're rejecting the whole impact factor thing as a measure, what's the point of the journal? Why can't the authors just self-publish on an open platform and have post-publication peer review? And
Well, I mean, I would argue it doesn't happen unless someone makes it happen. You go to bioRxiv, what percentage of articles have any comment at all? Like roughly 10% maybe, and most of those comments are author's corresponding address is now this, or nice article. There needs to be editorial oversight. Someone has to drive the process. If you go to F1000 Research, where the article is submitted, it gets a sanity check, it goes up online, and then it sort of sits there until someone comes along and peer reviews it. Well, there are plenty of articles that have been sitting there for 2 or 3 years unreviewed. Someone has to drive that process. And it's key to the validity, the whole curation. And I just,
you just need to
That's-
evangelize that.
Well, I think
yeah, no, but it's the, it's the story we need to tell is, we had a session earlier of, finding our voices as publishers. We have a really hard time articulating what do we do that's important, what value do we add, and we have the perfect narrative in society right now is we're inundated with propaganda and advertising masquerading as reality, and what we do is we provide a neutral third party who will very carefully curate information and verify and validate that for you and provide trustworthy source of information, which I think is more important than ever. And I think there's this sort of revelation in society that, that's actually worth paying for, whether it's an APC or a subscription charge. You look at what happened to the New York Times and the Washington Post subscriptions after the election. They've gone through the roof. I say, and that was my other session was, is don't just sit around thinking this, speak out, talk about the good things that you do.
Yeah. I think it's sort of what you started with. It's the letter of recommendation, right? I mean, by going through a peer-reviewed journal process where you know that the peer review is reliable, then you should have some level of confidence in that content.
Yeah, and as Marcel said in his opening talk, people don't want more to read. They want less to read. They want filters. They don't want, that's the struggle we always put up, right? If you like this, you may like this. And don't give me more to read. Figure out how to narrow that list down.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And one thing I had when you just said, there are new metrics like altmetrics, for instance, and the readers actually, or authors as well, check these. Do they check these, what the altmetrics are? So I'd rather publish in this, there may be different, or they will definitely be huge differences between subject areas, like social science is more important, altmetrics, for instance, and then natural sciences, the impact factor may be more important because they have a higher impact factor. And also, do they check the actual impact factor, like changes in impact factor? They know there's the top tier brands, but with the rest, do they actually go then, okay, well, I have to check first what the impact factor is. Do they do?
Yeah, so I would again make the distinction between a published author and a prospective author.
Yes.
And for published authors, the answer is yes. They absolutely pay attention to their article level metrics and the alt metric donut. They absolutely care about that. And that's something that they hopefully are including on their CV and on their grant applications to show that they are providing high impact content. For the prospective authors, not so much. They're looking more at an aggregated journal level metric. For readers, it can be an interesting discovery tool.
Yeah.
Show me the most commented on article or the most downloaded article in this particular topic.
Right, or that's been in socially bookmarked in a reference manager like Mendeley, for example.
Exactly, yeah.
I mean, I would say readers either completely ignore alt metrics or they check them obsessively.
Yeah.
Okay. You know, when I was a book editor, I had authors who like every hour would check the Amazon ranking of their book. Oh, it went up 50 points. Well, maybe somebody bought a copy of it. You know? So you know, I think what matters though, in the end, is going to be does the people who provide career advancement and funding care about it, and then I need to worry about it, and I'll check it. But a question I wanted to sort of ask was, and it's been on my mind since the opening talk at this meeting by Paula Stefan, is you now have this new, you know, well, it's not really new. I mean, I got out of science 20 years ago because the situation was exactly the same, where there aren't a lot of jobs, and very few people who get a PhD stay in science or research in general, I should say. There's been this attitude, this sort of old school, if you don't stay in academia, you're a failure. And I think that's slowly dying out. You have a whole cohort of these old school researchers who are slowly dying off. And I spent a day at Johns Hopkins recently and was told multiple times, oh, our graduate students are very clear they are not staying in academia. They have no illusions. They're all depressed about it, but they have no illusions whatsoever. So if 80% of the people who are doing the graduate school research, the postdocs and the students, are not going to be staying in academia, and they know that as you get this sort of cultural change, how does that affect publication decision? Of, you know what, I don't have to chase the impact factor because I'm going to go work for a law firm. I don't have to chase the impact factor because I'm going to go work on Wall Street. You know what, I think open access is really important. I don't have to worry about nature or whatever because I'm not staying in academia. I can do what I think is right. So I wanted to sort of put that question to both of you of does that
You have 5 minutes to get to your next session, by the way.
They can't start without me. I'm moderating it, don't worry.
I just realized it's 3:24 and this session was supposed to end at 3:15, but it's so interesting to talk about. And like I said, we could talk about branding all day.
Similarly, I think like this will definitely change, and this is kind of the effects that we also see with like emerging research communities from Asia, for instance, that they don't look so much at the actually recognition they get from the journal, rather than sharing the knowledge. It's out there. I did this, and that was it. So I don't worry actually what happens in the future with it, or whether I get a good impact factor brand onto my CV, because I just did this research and this should be out, this should be communicated. I think this is the direction that's going.
Great. Thank you all for hanging out.
Thank you all for hanging out.